Good afternoon. My name is Lynn-Ann Polite, and as a quick explanation, I'm in the midst of cataract surgery, hence the sunglasses. Not that I'm trying to be cool or anything, but that's why I have them on. So I want to first of all always really thank our generous sponsors, Ellen Kritzman and Tom and Ida Gay Nicolino. So they're here today. We're very thankful to them. We're going to get started really soon. I just want to tell you about the next talk. The next talk is part of our gallery talk series in the atrium, and it's September 28th at 2 p.m. And 4 of the artists who are exhibiting in the show Ignited by Vashon will be sharing their work and creative process and inspiration that they found by being here on Vashon at the Vashon Artist Residency. So when you go out there and you see the show, you'll see a lot of those stories. All this work was either inspired, started, continued, changed by the artists who are all off-islanders coming to our beloved island and being inspired by the island that we know is inspiring. So it's great. And this event in the atrium is free, and it's made possible by the generous support of Kathy Jenkins Estate. So, if for further ado, let's get Rebecca on the first of our 2025-26 series of art history talks. Rebecca.
I'm shorter. It'll work. Now this has got to go down a little. There, better. Hiroshige's final work, the collection of Japanese woodblock prints known as the 100 Famous Views of Edo, contains some of his most celebrated images. Indeed, some of the most renowned in all of Japanese art, like this striking print, Suido Bridge and Surugadai, which features a carp banner filling the bulk of the composition. Now, this is a samurai quarter of Edo, and the carp banners mark the Boys' Festival, the 5th day of the 5th month. Hiroshige himself was born into the lower ranks of the samurai class. Ando was his family name, while Utagawa is his artistic lineage. And you will sometimes see him called either Ando Hiroshige or Utagawa Hiroshige. His father was a fire warden, an honorable but very poorly paid position that Hiroshige inherited at age 12, when both of his parents died within a few weeks of one another. And you can see a black fire watch tower in the center of this mostly samurai district of Edo, the city we now call Tokyo. But Hiroshige's sympathies seem to lie more with the common people than with the samurai, whose military streamers we see here in the background. Commoners were not allowed such military regalia, so they developed the carp banners, whose imagery of fish fighting their way upstream was considered appropriate for young boys, but may also be Hiroshige's way of extolling the tenacity and spirit of the common people of Edo. And we will see that a lot in these prints. Unfortunately, Hiroshige died in October 1858 at the age of 61. And he had begun these views of Edo 2 years earlier, at about the same time that he shaved his head and became a Buddhist monk. And so we don't know what the final form of the 100 Views of Edo might have taken. Maybe he planned 1,000. But after his death, his publisher, Uoya Eikichi, commissioned this title page for the works that he had so far, which includes, it says, the four seasons, the names of the titles, Hiroshige's name, and it says below his name, Hiroshige, grand farewell performance. There would be no more lyrical landscapes emerging from his brush. There are actually 118 famous views of Edo included in the collection, although 3, which were published shortly after Hiroshige's death, are believed to be forgeries by his successor, Hiroshige II. All of the prints in the series are in the Oban size, a standard size of about 15.5 inches high by 10.5 inches wide. But before we begin, I want to understand what it is that we are looking at when we look at a color woodblock print. Ukiyo-e prints, literally pictures of the floating world, were a team effort. They required first a publisher who would underwrite a series like this, pay the designer, Hiroshige, and the craftsman, and reap any profit. So there was no copyright, there were no royalties. Designing these and carving the blocks was piecework, but the publisher, if it were a successful series, could just keep printing and printing and printing and make a lot of money. This publisher, Uoye Eikichi, his name, Uoye, means fish, or even fishmonger, which may have been his family or previous profession, but there are a number of fish references in the 100 views, like this dramatic image of a fishing net. That's what we're looking at. So these are the weights at the edges of this net through which we see some of the landscape beyond. And so that's a very new and bold composition, and it was Hiroshige's role to come up with it, to design the series, making first ink drawings of the outlines of these prints, and then full color renderings for each of the prints in this series. Now those drawings are pretty much destroyed in the printmaking process, which is depicted in this wonderful triptych by Hiroshige's exact contemporary Utagawa Kunisada, of women producing woodblock prints. So that original drawing on very, very fine rice paper would be flipped upside down and glued to a wooden block, which the key block carver would carve with very, very fine carving tools until just the lines remained. Everything that would not be lines is carved away from that block. And we see another worker here sharpening the tools. The block printer had to be anal, very, very careful, because if you slipped, you could destroy, days of work. But then the printers would print. And not only did the block carver have to carve that key block, but because these are color prints, which used up to 20 individual blocks for each of the colors involved, you also had to carve a block for each color, which meant you could use a bigger chisel because you might only need a small patch left on the surface to have your yellow, for instance, or your bright red, and everything else needed to be carved away. So the principle is that of relief printing. It's the same thing in potato printing. If you ever, as a child, cut a potato in half and made a design by carving parts away, what remains, what you do not carve away, that is what prints. And the other work women here are dampening the paper, mixing up the colors. This is an inked print where you can see that there are just a few patches of a red that have been inked. And whereas Western printmakers usually use a roller to put the ink on, it's done individually with brushes in the Japanese woodblock print tradition. So in 1950, an expert on woodblock prints and a maker himself published a book he called The Process of Color Block Printing that includes these wonderful visual guides. So he laid out step by step how to do a 14-layer print. So this is the key block. This is the one where everything is carved away except for the lines with the very, very fine knives. Here, there's just one color on this sheet, and then Watanabe shows us how it looks on the key block, which isn't always printed first. So for each color, and I don't have all of them, but just a few to give you an idea, for each color, he would do it on a blank piece of paper and then show how it added to the scene. So this gray overlays that pinkish orange to create this brown. And a different brown is in the trunks of the trees, which are not part of this block, so that we get the gray of the sky. You can see that there have been some intermediate stages here. Here are the greens, the pine needles that will go on the tree, the greens of these costume details. The very final block is the red one that includes the title block, and the censor's stamp was part of Edo period production, and these further red details. But it takes these 14 subtle layers to get to your final product, and in some case there would be 20 or even more. This is a different, earlier image of the printing process, and instead of Western printmakers who usually put the paper down and the block on top, in this case, the paper is placed on top of the block, and it is rubbed with a baren, which is this instrument here. It's made of bamboo, and you rub it over the inked block to get your image. Now, would women have done this? No. These prints of women making woodblock prints were made because occasionally the government censors outlawed bijinga, the genre of images of beautiful women, usually courtesans. And so for public morality purpose, they would say no more bijinga. So artists would cleverly get around it by saying, oh, these aren't courtesans, these are block printers. Doing trades. But the individualized process, the nature of Japanese woodblock prints, means that no two final prints are exactly the same. And there is no original. The original, that drawing, would have been cut up and pasted onto various blocks in the block making process. These are multiples. They are always intended to be produced and sold as multiples. But look at these two horikiri iris gardens. The one on the right is purple irises. The somewhat later impression on the left, yellow irises. So everything that is purple here, including the robes of these people in the background, is yellow here. And this iris is completely a solid yellow, whereas this one is not. It's the same block, but in this earlier, more careful impression, a technique called bokashi is used by the printer. And it's bokashi that gives us these gradations in the sky where they will put on a heavy layer of ink and then fade it into a lighter color. But here, they've also used bokashi on the iris petals, just applying the ink on the edges and then shading that so it looks like it's a white center with purple edges. So each one is different depending on the whim of the printer and how much energy they are putting into it, and each one is beautiful. Now, this reminds us that Hiroshige was an excellent practitioner of the bird and flower genre, and he too tried his hand early in his career at bijinga, those images of beautiful women like the one that you see here. But his career really took hold after Hokusai, around 1830, published his 36 views of Mount Fuji, which revolutionized landscape as a genre for woodblock print production. Hokusai often gives us images without human presence, like this red Fuji. Hiroshige would produce his own series of images, including Fuji places in Ando, the eastern capital. But Hiroshige almost always shows human presence. So he began to make landscape images around Ando, and then he had the opportunity to join an entourage of samurai who were on an embassy bringing horses from Edo to the imperial court in Kyoto. And he sketched every step of the way on that journey. Because he was of the samurai class, he was allowed to join this procession. And when he returned, he created his first blockbuster series of prints, an ambitious undertaking of depicting the 53 marked way stations of the Tokaido Road, the main thoroughfare from Edo to Kyoto. This was a period in which the emperor in Kyoto was nominally the ruler of Japan, but the real power lay with the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo. And the shogun's daimyo, their military retainers, were conscripted to spend every other year in Edo, in the capital. So they had to do a lot of traveling back and forth from their own lands to the capital. The roads were good, and people started using them for what we think of as travel, to go places, to see new things. And so Hiroshige gets in on this new interest in varying landscapes, in the sorts of things one might see if one took this road to Kyoto. But we see that his sympathies lie not with the wealthy woman in her palanquin being carried by these nearly naked bearers, but with the common people who are doing the work. In another of the 53 stations, Mariko, this is this beautiful tonal landscape of a station that was famous for its yam soup. So that is advertised on the sign, and we see this this hut as this place of welcome for the pilgrim, for the traveler. So from that point forward, he would continue to make images in and around Edo and images going back and forth between Edo and Kyoto. But for his final series, which became the 100 Views, he begins it with Nihon Bashi, the Japan Bridge. It had been decreed by the first Tokugawa shogun shortly after 1600 that all distances in Japan should be measured from this bridge. So it is literally the starting point on any journey one might take within Japan. And he had started his 53 stations of the Tokaido there as well, but that was a print where he got right down, looked at the bridge from the side, from actual street height, and we see the teeming melee of people crossing, whereas for his famous views of Edo, he's taking a bird's eye view. We are far away, we see Fuji in the background, and it's winter. So the 100 scenes progress from winter, spring, summer, fall, and back to winter. And if we look closely in this image, the foreground depicts the fish market. And there are enormous tunas down here, tunas that require 2 people to lift. So that's a nod to his publisher, whose name meant fish. In number 3, we start to see some typical Hiroshige strategies within this series. So it is, it's New Year's. And people in the popular quarter in the distance are flying kites. And this wall that you just see here is the shogun's, this is the shogun's moat. This is the fortification of the shogun's palace, but one of these commoners' kites has gotten sort of cheekily wrapped up in one of these shogun's trees. Now we see the kites, we don't see who's flying them, but there are people in the foreground as well. All we see of them are their paddles. Those are shuttlecock paddles, and that is the shuttlecock. So it was characteristic, it was traditional to play badminton on New Year's Day. So we have the paddles, we have the shuttlecock, we have this unusual, very near and very far juxtaposition. In number 6, Hiroshige takes us to the Hatsune riding grounds, which were historically places for training horses, but by Hiroshige's day, the riding grounds had been largely abandoned to the use of the cloth dyers. So we have these arabesques of plum and saffron and white cloth along the foreground of the image, whereas prominent in the background is a fire tower, reminding us of Hiroshige's and his father's employment as fire wardens. By this time, he had passed that position on to his adopted son, but it still meant something to him sentimentally. In number 8, we see the commercial district, Surugucho, and this is an important shopping area within Ando, but this is an unusually symmetrical scene that is evidence of Hiroshige looking at Western prints, looking at single point perspective and how Western artists use straight lines to convey a sense of distance. However, it's been noted that if you were standing in roughly the position where the print is made from and looking at the shopping distance receding, Fuji would be a tiny bump on the horizon, not this looming presence. So Hiroshige would rather be dramatic than geographically accurate. So this symmetrical quality and the use of Western perspective are unusual in his work, but not unheard of. Here too, he usually favors a more zigzag path into the landscape, like the one created by the pond here in this garden at Fukugawa Hachiman Shrine. Now this too is symmetrical. It's got this tree right in the middle and daringly cropped at the top. And Western artists would be looking at these sorts of startling compositions. And whereas all of Hokusai's landscape work is horizontal in what we call landscape format. And most of Hiroshige's earlier work, like all of the 53 stations of the Tokaido, is also in landscape format. Every one of the 100 famous views of Edo is in portrait format. It is this vertical format that allows, even forces, Hiroshige into these more dramatic croppings. In number 11, we see the edge of the terrace at Kiyomizu Hall, and we see this very famous moon pine tree there on the left, the one that is sort of growing in a circle. And he's exaggerating the height of the pine trees and the angle of the viewing porch, but it's important in Tokyo to pay attention, in Edo, to pay attention to trees. And we'll see a number of famous trees in this work. Now in this work, number 20, we see an industrial part of Edo in that these are boats laden with lumber that usually only go downstream. But Hiroshige has them pulling in both directions, upstream and downstream, I think for his own compositional devices for the zigzag pattern here. Again, the accuracy is less important than the drama of the scene. And in number 21, we see this dramatically raised rice paddle in the center of the landscape that goes way out to the distance to sailboats on the far horizon. So this figure is the central actor in the heaping rice ceremony performed at a particular shrine, the Utagawa shrine, on the third day of the new year. So this is a figure praying for bounty in the new year. Chiyogaike Pond shows us another feature from Western art that Hiroshige has adopted. Reflections. They are not traditionally part of Japanese art. And in fact, if you look back at the 53 stations of Tokaido, of those bearers of the palanquin, we don't see their reflections. But here we do. We even see this very tall tree with its tip reflected in the water. So he's interested in certain conventions of Western painting. Here we get another zigzag view into the landscape, and this is New Fuji Meguro. Now, this is an artificial Mount Fuji, constructed in 1819. It was believed to be spiritually important for Japanese to ascend Mount Fuji at least once in their lifetime. But it was understood that not everyone was capable physically of doing so. So later in the Edo period, several of these mini Mount Fujis were constructed so that people could gain the same benefits from ascending them as they might from scaling Fuji itself, which looms here in the background. And you can see that it is spring now. And the plum garden Kamata is one of the images that Tacoma Art Museum is using to promote their current exhibition of Japanese woodblock prints. And it's an unusual composition because we see these trees, but in the corner we see a palanquin. This is one of those carrying carts for the very wealthy, but it seems to be floating. We don't see the carriers. It's a little offsetting. There are also grave markers that are dotting the garden. And that one there, and that one there. And Hiroshige has deliberately placed them behind trees, obscuring those from his scene. So there's something a little bit eerie, even about this beautiful springtime composition. Now, of course, the Japanese would go out in droves to view the most beautiful cherries. And this is the most famous tree in Edo, the sleeping dragon plum, which was known for the purity of its double blossoms. One guidebook of the era said that the blossoms were, quote, so white when in full bloom as to drive off the darkness, end quote. And Hiroshige dramatically foregrounds this hoary, ancient plum tree against the orchard beyond. Some of his views are nighttime scenes. This one of Matsuchiyama and Samya Canal. And this has a very different feel. And in the nighttime scenes in particular, you can see the grain of the wood. Can you see that in the darker areas? From the wood block that would be that would be inked and then printed. And this is a prostitute that we see walking along, and she's led by her attendant, and all we see of the attendant is that bulge of a lantern in front of her. So her way is being lit through the gloom, through the darkness. Now, each of these squares in the corner is the title of that particular work. It tells us, where it is, and every one is different. So here, we're getting a Baroque double blossoming tree at the Suijin shrine. We see that dramatic peak in the background and another sort of zigzag pattern that is so characteristic of Hiroshige in miniature here in the greens, and that's created by having different blocks, green, but also a gray with just the darker areas, and then the whole of the composition has its own sort of zigzag as well. This view is from an interior, and just as dramatic, where we get this half-circle window. It is still spring out there. We see some cherry blossoms lingering on those trees. We see commerce going on. We see boating, but it's all from an interior. And we even get just this hint of a vase there on the left. So, something ikebana, perhaps. Tile kilns and Hashiba Ferry evokes an ancient literary reference, which is in the little gulls that are crossing the Sumida River in the 10th century epic Tales of Ise. We see them here on the river. And often there are nods within these works to Hiroshige's more educated viewers, but these were not for the ultra-wealthy or the ultra-sophisticated, because you needed to print at least 200 to break even. And because a popular series could go into a print run of hundreds, sometimes even thousands, this was popular art. You could buy one of these for the price of a bowl of noodles for your dinner. So they are understandable both on a more lofty samurai background point of view, but also for the ordinary people of Edo. They would have been affordable for craftsmen like Hiroshige himself and his carvers. This smoke is done with that bokashi technique where it's gradated, thicker here, and then thinner, just dark at the edges. We see the bokashi technique with the dark blues on the edges of the river and the little patch where the gulls are resting. And here we know that it is still spring because petals are raining down. So what we're seeing is a pleasure boat. Distant view of Kinryuzan Temple way back there, but in the foreground, that boldly cropped figure of a geisha here. And she's surely not alone on this boat. And in the detail, we can see the cherry blossoms, which would have had their own block, and yet they're not printed solid pink. Instead, each one is smudged with just a hint of pink to make it look more, more naturalistic. It's extraordinary work. And the earliest copies are the most finely printed. As this one got more popular and more were run, the printers worked faster. They didn't do this individual attention. But you see as well the pattern of the geisha's kimono and obi and her undergarment and this marvelous hair ornament and the detail of the city in the background. Edo was a city of wood, which is why the fire wardens were so important. Nihonbashi and Edobashi Bridge is this image. So instead of being on the water, we are on a bridge. And that's Nihonbashi in the background. This bridge, though, we see just the upright, the slats, and then we see a bucket that is suspended with these hemp ropes from something to carry it with over one shoulder. And in the bucket, yes, another fish, the first bonito of the season. This signified the beginning of summer, and fishermen competed to get the first bonito to market because you could get an outrageous price for the first catch of the season. More commerce on view in this view of the Nihonbashi district. There are things being sold, and everyone is hiding under their parasols or hats because the sun is so strong. That's members of a religious procession dancing in the foreground. Very differently, he turns to Fudo Falls. So this was a waterfall that isn't quite that high, that was sacred to the spirit Fudo, a healing spirit who was always seen with fire and a naked sword. So to suggest Fudo's sword, Hiroshige has the printer do a very strong, dark bokashi in the center of the waterfall, paler towards the side, so that it looks rather sword-like. And then we see in the foreground a couple of tourists or pilgrims, someone who was actually getting into the sacred pond, people picnicking, offering refreshments. So this is all part of the commercial life of Edo, as is this poor turtle. So here again, we are seeing part of a bucket. So the round edge of the bucket, like the one that mackerel was in. Here, though, instead of the ropes, it has a solid upright. And dangling from that upright is this hapless turtle, a symbol of longevity in Chinese and Japanese folklore. And turtles were bred for sale as pets. They could also be eaten, but it was common for their breeders to offer turtles for sale near bridges so that people needing extra karma could purchase them and release them into the waterway as a good deed to create positive karma. And this is just such a wonderful composition in that we see, the edge of the bridge, the upright, and the turtle is dangling right over Mount Fuji. So it's quite dramatic. Perhaps Hiroshige's most famous work is his sudden shower on the Shinohashi Bridge. He's used two different blocks for the rain, a darker gray and a lighter gray. And we just get that sense that we are getting drenched. All of his rainfall scenes are in the summer. And his landscapes are never devoid of emotion. So we get just this sense of these people that are covering themselves and rushing off the bridge, trying to escape that summer squall. And here, the Brooklyn Museum set, I've used a lot from theirs because they are particularly fine early set. And the bokashi at the top, instead of the usual straight line that's then sort of squeegeed into a paler color, here the bokashi is this irregular, cloudy darkness that's looming there at the top, giving us that sense of lowering clouds. From this, we go to one of his most subtle images, the pine of success, another of these famous trees at Umagayashi. And this is erotic art. How do we know that? Well, this is a pleasure boat, very similar to the one we saw the geisha sitting in with the plum blossoms, but now the blinds are closed over the interior, and there are two pairs of sandals here on the deck. And you'll note that the water's fairly calm, except around the boat. So it's very subtle conveyance of an erotic quality. Komakata Hall has another poetic reference. And again, we have those wonderful smudged clouds here, and not just the bokashi at the top. The red flag, red for rouge or lipstick, is advertising a cosmetics shop, suggesting a beautiful woman. But the cuckoo in the sky, so prominently at the top, is associated with loneliness in Japanese poetry. And it's placed here in reference to a famous love poem by a Yoshiwara courtesan awaiting the return of her lover. She waits for him at Komakata Hall and evokes the loneliness of the cuckoo's cry that intensifies her own longing. So we're in summer now, and this famous image of the drum bridge at Kamedo Tenjin Shrine with its wisteria has inspired many Japanese gardens in the West and Monet's bridge. The Sakasai ferry is in the background in this scene, taking passengers back and forth. But this image has an effect that is so subtle I can't show it to you because the egrets, they're just white, so they are the white of the paper, but they have their own blocks just for texture. So they are embossed. The white part is placed over a block and rubbed to get a wing texture that you can see with the naked eye, but which is very difficult to show in reproduction. This is another scene of a ferry, but instead of being in the distance, we are in the ferry. We are looking, under the armpit of the ferryman, between him and another passenger as we are crossing over towards Benten Shrine. We get the knobbly knees and even the leg hair of the ferryman as part of this image. The Dyer's Quarter image is the only one in which we see Hiroshige's personal mark. And it's carved on one of these vertical strips, but on the front one is the mark of his publisher. So with characteristic humility, Hiroshige places himself behind his publisher, Woye Eikichi. We see again Fuji in the background, and while he and his publisher are acknowledged in print 75, number 76 is the only one that bears the name of the carver that we believe to have executed all or nearly all of the 100 Views of Edo, Horitake. And that is written on one of the lanterns that is being carried, just left of center, being carried across the bridge. And because Horitake is very similar to the word for bamboo in Japanese, it is appropriate to acknowledge him in this scene of the bamboo yards. Kanasugi Bridge shows a procession, this colorful array of banners and things that are being borne to honor Nichiren, the founder of a Buddhist sect. And it's not clear whether it's the beginning or the end of that festival. Possibly it compresses both the lightheartedness of the beginning with the tired participants returning at the end of the day. Number 82, Moon Viewing Point, is another of his really famous works. We see the moon, and we see this terrace. And this, too, is another very subtly erotic work. We see the remains of a meal. We see a wine vessel here, and we see the edges of a kimono and the shadow of a geisha behind that rice paper screen. Some of his are more wholesome, like Grandpa's Tea House. And he goes back and forth between interior and exterior, between this very sort of traditional landscape scene and others that are much more innovative. This is a group of samurai on a procession. They're supposed to be understood as going uphill here on the right. And this is number 86. These are the sort of grunting samurai with their banners. But number 86, instead of samurai, we have the hindquarters of horses. So we don't know if that was Hiroshige's order, his final order for this series that was, after all, given its ultimate order after his death, or whether this is the wit of his publisher to put 86 after 85, to put horses' asses in place of samurai, that may be expressing a view that was not allowed to be publicly proclaimed in this rather subtle way. But it's also, this image is of a more rundown quarter of Edo, where the prostitutes were described as flowers blooming in the horse droppings of Yotsuya. And we even get the horse droppings. Here he focuses in on that famous moon pine that earlier we saw from a terrace. And in the center, viewed in that circle, we find again the fire warden's tower that is so significant to him personally. Another more Western view with Saruwakamachi, another commercial quarter of Edo. And then in number 98, this celebratory image of fireworks at Ryogoku, where the fireworks even seem to take over the title block. And this may have been the inspiration for Whistler's famous Nocturne in Black and Gold, the work that John Ruskin described as throwing a pot of paint in the viewer's face. By 99, it is clearly winter again. And here again, I show you two different views to suggest just how different the color choices can be between one impression and the next. This is actually the temple where Hiroshige is buried. Nihon Embankment is how you get to the Yoshiwara Pleasure Quarter. And over its 800-yard length, there were 100 tea houses, each of which was linked to a particular brothel. So you could have your tea and select your other delights at the same time. And this is a view, from one of those brothels. So this is from a second-story window in the Yoshiwara Pleasure Quarters on their busiest day of the year, the Torino Machi Festival. We know that because in the distance we can see the procession going by with its banners, its standards, and someone has gifted our courtesan with hairpins in the same style as these procession standards. So we just see the cat looking out. We just see the hairpins again. We have the suggestion of action going on. And in fact, this was the one day of the year where every prostitute was expected to have a paying customer. If she did not, she had to pay her brothel or her pimp. But there's also this paper, this tissue that was known as the paper for the honorable act. These cranes were protected. They were, even now, they are a symbol of Japan, and they were only allowed to be hunted once a year when the shogun sent out his falcons. And a falcon would bring down the first crane and take it as a gift to the emperor. The rest of the year, they were protected. These women were not protected. They are very low-class prostitutes, not in a nice room in the Yoshiwara district, but plying their trade on the riverbank, and they often wore extremely thick white makeup because they were pockmarked by disease, and they were covering that. So Hiroshige depicts them as almost ghost-like, but with, I think, a great deal of sympathy. His Fukugawa lumber yards are quite dramatic in their use of diagonals and zigzags. And again, we have the difference that the printer can make. These look, at first glance, like two different scenes entirely. One has a dark blue background, another has a pale gray background with a gray cloud in the center and that strong blue going down the center. But those were just different choices made during the printing process. Here we see a sea eagle diving down. Literally, we have an eagle's eye view of the landscape below. And he goes from eagles to sparrows. In this image of Yabu Lane, where we see the birds in flight, the people with snow on their umbrellas as they trek through the new downfall. Now, in general, Hiroshige was not interested in the mythological, the genre that was so beloved of his contemporary Utagawa Kuniyoshi, who did ghosts and heroes fighting giant carps and other mythological things. But the very final image of the 100 Views of Ado is this one, and it is mythological. It's foxfire. It was said that on the last day of the year, all of the foxes would gather at a particular tree near Oji Inari shrine, and on the way, they would breathe flames. And the farmers watching would interpret the flames to understand how their crops were going to turn out that year. We have that same word, foxfire, in English for that same phenomenon of explaining swamp gases and other strange nocturnal lights. But in English, it probably comes from the word faux in French, not from actual foxes. Here, we see the foxes gathered around the tree at midnight. It's a lyrical, mysterious, beautiful image. And all of these images were extremely influential on Western artists. I've already cited Whistler as one of the most enthusiastic about Hiroshige's works. Here, his mistress examines prints from the 100 Views, and he probably used this image as an inspiration on his own series of images of Battersea Bridge. But the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were equally influenced by Hiroshige, whose most direct impact was on Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh copied to Hiroshige's his famous sudden shower and his plum estate Kamedo. And Van Gogh loved the brilliance of the colors of these images, their general lack of shading, just the brightness and flatness of the colors, and used the dramatic croppings and diagonals of Japanese art when making works like the Sower. Of course, Monet designed his own Japanese bridge at Giverny in emulation of Hiroshige's bridge. But Japanese art was only able to influence the West because Western powers had forced open Japan's borders. In 1853, the black warships of Commodore Matthew Perry threatened to attack Japan if its leadership did not begin trading with the West. And 3 years after Hiroshige's death, his successor, Hiroshige II, depicted this American steamship. And he would, in his career, produce many images of Europeans with their strange garb and strange modern inventions, whereas Hiroshige stayed with the flourishing of his native city, the ceremonies and the legends of his beloved hometown, rather than depicting those incursions that started to happen just a few years before his death. This one is a festival day, and it's the only one in the whole 118 that doesn't give a specific location, just Tanabata Festival, but it's believed to be the view from his own house. Now, Hiroshige was not allowed to criticize the government, and every one of these images had to be pre-approved by a government censor before it could be printed. But we do have to wonder if this image of the old pine propped up that's coming from a daimyo's garden is suggestive of his feelings about the government. Still, what he depicted was the beauty of Edo, the resiliency of its occupants, its relationship with the natural world, these surroundings that he knew and loved. And in number 91, inside the Akiba shrine, he may have put a self-portrait. That monk who seems to be drawing the scene before him. The 100 Famous Views of Edo was truly a grand farewell performance, not only for Hiroshige himself, but for the Edo period as a whole, before Japan was forced to join the modern world. Thank you. So, are there questions? Yes.
Could you talk a little about the materials they were using? Were they inks? Were they paints? Were they natural materials? And did they fade over time?
Those are all excellent questions. So the materials that he is using is what we call rice paper, but it's really mulberry paper. And cherry wood for the blocks, and inks, colored inks, which are very traditional for the most part, except that some new dyes had been recently introduced from the West, and one of those is, it's this deep dark blue that we see so often in Hiroshige's late work. It's a Prussian blue. And the word in Japanese is it's something that's not quite, but sort of Prussian. Did the colors fade? Yes, they are. Both the colors and the paper are light sensitive. So the current exhibition in Tacoma is in 3 stages. It's being rehung 3 times, or hung once and then rehung twice, because you can't allow Japanese woodblock prints to be on view for a year. They have very specific conditions under which they can be exhibited, lower light, and then if they go on view for X number of months, then they need to be put back in a dark place for twice that many months. So they are light sensitive, they do fade, but they're pretty resistant because all of these are over 150 years old and have survived really quite well. Some of the oranges, and this is one of the panels where they have survived really well, but some of the kind of orangish reds in some of the autumn scenes that I didn't bring in have discolored. And so we don't get the full glory of those autumnal tree color changing landscapes. But for the most part, they've survived really very, very well. Yes, in the center. The wood used for the wood blocks is cherry wood. Mm-hmm. So it's just, a hard wood that is good for carving.
Can you see an example of
Oh, that's a really good question. Can you see an example of the wood blocks? I do not know if these survive, although they survived for quite a while. Probably some museums have examples of them, and I haven't gotten to Tacoma yet. But the last time they did a Japanese woodblock print exhibition, this was several years ago, but they did have a really good section for here is what a woodblock print looks like. Here are what the materials look like. Here are some of the stages of it. But the woodblocks were not considered sacrosanct. They would eventually wear down and often would be recarved if it was a popular subject. But scholars know this is woodblock one. This is woodblock one before it starts wearing down. This is it maybe after 1,000 printings. Here is, here's a section where, this part broke and they had to plug it. That's sometimes perceivable. So it's possible that you can see the woodblocks in the Tacoma exhibition, that they have at least one to look at. But where these specific woodblocks are that were used to print Hiroshige's 100 Views, I'm not certain. Yes?
Yes, foxfire is the name for a natural phenomenon that apparently occurs in North Carolina swamps. And it's also the name of a really lovely movie about 40 years old with Jessica Tandy and Hugh Conan about that.
I do not know that movie. A very beautiful movie. So yes, foxfire is the English word for this phenomenon of, I guess, gases that rise and are visible at night, that light up like fireflies. But what I think is so interesting is that the same word is used for this phenomenon, that there's no cultural connection whatsoever between the rise of this word in English and the rise of this word in Japanese. And in both cases, we call it foxfire. Yes?
Well, would the prints themselves be sold in galleries?
Oh, that's also a really good question. Would the prints themselves be sold in galleries? The prints would actually have been sold in Edo bookshops. And you would have found piles of them. I could have brought in a hokusai image of such a bookshop with piles of prints. And most of these prints, because he started the series a couple of years before his death, and only after his death, his publisher organized them into the 100 Famous Views of Edo and issued luxury editions of the whole 118 of them. So that would have been an expensive proposition to buy the 118. But before that, the prints would have been sold individually. They would have been available individually, and they would have cost, like $12, or the equivalent of that. So not a princely sum. Maybe not even that much. Roughly what a bowl of noodles with fish or something, a meal would cost. So it's hard to say, would a meal cost $12 or $5 or $40? But they were accessible. They were more like magazines than like oil paintings, if that makes sense. So one of the most popular genres of Japanese woodblock prints was actor prints. Your Tom Cruise of the day, your they were all men, even the ones playing female roles. And another, of course, as I've mentioned, were the courtesan prints. And so these were celebrities, images of celebrities like you get on the cover of People magazine. But they were also, obviously something like this it's not to promote a crush or anything. It's not to get you into the theater, but this is something to enjoy aesthetically. But it's maybe more like a poster. You might hang it on your wall for a while, but not necessarily enshrine it and imagine that this is going to be a valuable object in 175 years. This was really popular art. It wasn't individually painted onto silk, like the ink paintings that an artist like Hokusai was also producing. Hokusai was one of the few woodblock print designers who both designed prints and painted his own individual compositions, which were meant to be one original painting and not a multiple. So I can't even remember what the original question was. Where you would buy them. Bookstores. Bookstores would be a place to buy these. And the bookstores were, because books were very expensive and were often many, many volumes, and real estate was also very expensive. Bookstores were often just sort of shop fronts, and you would rent a book, and it would come from like your Amazon warehouse. Your boys, your 12-year-olds their job might be running books to one customer or another, bringing books all around Edo. But those storefronts would have, one of the ways of getting people into the bookshop was the prints. Oh, there, yes?
Can we hear more about the loss of the parents and then what happened in his life?
Oh, I don't know so much about Hiroshige's personal life. I know that both of his parents died when he was 12, and that meant that he was the eldest son. He was promoted to this position of fire warden, which must just be a terrifying thing for a 12-year-old. But he was also training at some point with Utagawa Toyokuni, his master. And so I don't know if he paid someone else to do the fire warden duties while he was in his training. I don't know if he had another relative who kind of took over his care, or if he was essentially on his own from 12 forward. I just don't know that much about his personal life. So, and I don't believe he had any children, or at least any that followed him, because his, Hiroshige 2 and 3, they were former apprentices, but they were not his biological children. So yes. What is the current modern version of woodblock printing in Japan? Well, there's the whole manga tradition. But there are still fine artists making mokuhanga, making Japanese woodblock prints in the traditional way. Some make prints of Mount Fuji and the sunrise. Some make abstract prints. Some make prints of Marvel's superheroes. Some use these very traditional techniques to make very modern prints, but the techniques themselves are still being used, and not only by Japanese artists. So there are some really fine British artists who work with multicolor woodblock printing. there are artists here in the States, all over the world. It's such a beautiful technique. You can go on Etsy and find lots of artists who are making woodblock prints. But in Japan today, probably the same sort of spirit would be in manga and in anime, in the book and video technology that was less accessible at this time. Because books in this period were still made with woodblock prints. Each character was carved for each page.
We'll do one more. You had one more right there.
Yeah, I see a hand in the very back. That is exactly true. The first prints that arrived in, say, Paris, because they were not expensive, and because at a certain point they were also sort of time limited. If you had 1,000 prints of actor so and so doing a particular role, and that closed, well, you might have remainders. And so what did they do with those? They wrapped porcelain. They wrapped items, luxury items, that were going to Europe for sale. And so they were first seen unwrapping other things. And there's an artist named Felix Bracquemond, who first saw hokusai prints that way, and he ended up doing a lot of work that uses hokusai's manga, his sketchbooks. He did a whole suite of dinnerware, of dishes, with very Japanese designs on them. But yes, that was how that started. And then quickly it became apparent that there was a demand for the prints themselves. And so there was a flourishing print trade in Paris and London and other urban centers in Europe, selling Japanese woodblock prints by, I'd say, at least the 1880s. So, yes.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. And Lynn, what is my next talk date?
It's in November.
In November, I will be back talking about an exhibition that's coming to SAM called To Table, Food, Art, and Identity in the Age of Impressionism. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I will be introducing you to the exhibit, and we'll be looking at, one of the interesting things to me about it is that it is both Impressionist paintings and academic paintings side by side of the same subjects, of still lives, of harvesting and food markets and so forth. So it's a really interesting moment in French artistic history. So thank you all so much.